and skill they need to get a job on the outside. And I'm beefing up as well Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons so that they have the teeth when a prison isn't working, when it's failing, to intervene and to make the Secretary of State act. That's me. As I said before, at another event with Ian Duncan Smith, and I'm so grateful for his help and involvement in this, a prisoner's family is the most effective resettlement agency. We know that by improving those family ties, by keeping people linked in with their family, it gives them hope, and it also helps turn around lives for the next generation as well. And thanks to all the evidence collected by Lord Farmer's review, governors will have access to comprehensive data to help them decide what works best to bolster positive family ties. And I also want to congratulate the CSJ for their work in highlighting the importance of fathers. I think that we must always remember that when we look at the justice system overall, because the involvement of fathers is vitally important. The ability, when we have these reforms in place, and we've got the bill coming up soon, we've got new measures on league tables, performance agreements with governors, we've got the new agency commencing in April. It will take time to bed in, but once it's in place, we will be able to measure, we'll be able to learn from the best, and we'll be able to intervene in those prisons that aren't working. We'll know better which prisons aren't working. This change will not happen in weeks or months. It will take time and determination to deliver. But as a society, we simply cannot afford to put this off any longer. All of the people in the room are vital to this change. I know there are many of you who've been involved for years in turning around our prisons, and I'm grateful for your work. And I think there is a big opportunity here. There is a growing political consensus that we do need to address this issue of our poor reoffending rates and our failure to reform people in prisons. But I do warn you that profound changes in our prison population make the need for reform even tougher, but they also make it even more critical. So we have a challenging time ahead, but an incredibly important time ahead. And I'm incredibly proud to be leading this department, the Ministry of Justice, at this time. I'm equally determined to address the factors that fuel prolific offending for other crimes, like theft and shoplifting, that can all too often put offenders on the path to a prison sentence. Reforming the criminal justice system does not begin and end with reforming prisons or probation, though that is a critical place to start. We also need to intervene earlier by giving our courts the right tools for reform. There can never be an excuse for committing crime, but too often people are ending up in prison because our interventions to tackle problems like drug addiction or mental health don't work as well as they should. As I've said, the number of first-time offenders in the system has fallen by 57% since 2006, whereas our reoffending rates have stayed flat. This means that the police, prison officers and probation staff see the same faces over and over again. And it means that our communities end up being blighted by the same people. Any MP will tell you that one of their most frequent complaints in their surgery is from law-abiding residents who can't understand why a small number of people are allowed to wreak so much havoc in their neighbourhood. So just as we are giving prison and probation staff more power to reform offenders, our courts should also be able to play a frontline role in reforming criminals and getting them to quit crime for good. Research that we've done at the Ministry of Justice shows that community sentences are most effective when they tackle the problems that contribute to the offender's crime. So mental health treatment requirements are some of our most effective measures that can help get somebody's life back on track. But if I tell you the proportion of our community sentences that have mental health treatment orders is only 1%, you will see where the problem lies. We need a much more systematic, nationally consistent approach that provides quicker and more certain access to those mental health treatments for offenders who need it, because that will stop them and prevent them getting into a position that leads to a custodial sentence. And I'm working very closely with the Health Secretary, who is extremely committed to this, and NHS England to develop a new mental health protocol which will operate across the country. It will ensure timely access to mental health services where the courts impose a mental health treatment requirement as part of a sentence. And I'm also working with the Judiciary and the Health Secretary to make sure courts have better access to psychologists to diagnose and oversee treatment of offenders. We've already got great work taking place in Newcastle, where a dedicated mental health team produces reports for sentences. And this means we're seeing fewer cases adjourn early because they need an expensive expert report. We're getting that expertise in-house, and we're getting people the treatment they need to sort out those issues before it leads to further crime. And in Milton Keynes, we've got a bespoke service which has dramatically increased the number of sentences involving mental health treatment orders. I'd like to see that approach adopted right across the country. We also need to do more to tackle the scourge of drink and drugs. 62% of prisoners who reported using drugs in the 4 weeks before custody reoffended in a year after release. But in 2015, drugs treatment orders accounted for only 5% of the treatments attached to community sentences. So again, we have these very effective interventions that simply aren't being used enough. I note again that the Centre for Social Justice has written on this subject, calling for the greater use of drug courts with rigid compliance in its Ambitious for Recovery report. And evidence from Australia suggests that those who adhere to drug treatment orders are 37% less likely to reoffend. Early intervention by our courts is vitally important, in particular in stopping women offenders from ending up in prison. And we'll be announcing our strategy shortly for women later this year. And we've already announced a new director for women in custody in the community. Her name's Sonia Crozier. I believe it's the first time ever that the agency responsible for prisons and probation have a single person responsible for women across community and custody. Family drugs and alcohol courts, like the one I visited in Maidstone a few weeks ago, will play a vital role in this. I believe that judges are as important in reforming people as any probation or prison officer. Working with local authorities, judges closely oversee compliance with treatment programmes. I've watched it in action. I know that it works. Over 26 weeks, those taking part have to comply with drug testing and therapy sessions to stay clean. This sort of consistent supervision and support, overseen by one judge over a long period of time, is helping women beat the addictions that can fuel crime, and it's making it more likely they'll be able to have custody of their children. And if I give you one example of many, a woman called Jenny, that's a name I've made up, but it was a real case, has transformed from a drug-dependent 25-year-old with a 5-year-old daughter to a woman determined to do right by her child. Without that intervention, Jenny would have continued to steal to feed her habit. Jenny now has a chance at a better life, and also her daughter does too. There are people who would dismiss this as soft justice. I would call it decency and common sense, because without this court intervening, without this intervention, Jenny's path was almost certainly leading her to prison. How many more victims of crime would there have been before that happened? How many more working people would have returned home to find their back window smashed and their treasured possessions gone? And what about the children, too, of offenders, like the case I've just mentioned? All of the evidence shows that children whose parents end up in prison are much more likely to end up there too. 2/3 of boys separated from imprisoned parents go on to offend themselves. Chances are that they would grow up to rob and steal to feed a habit, and we end up with generation upon generation of blighted lives and blighted communities. Early intervention is not a nice to have. It's not an added extra to the justice system. It is a vital component of it if we are ever to break the cycle of crime, punishment and more crime. Finally, I want to address the issue of the management of our current prison population. We are making progress, but there is more we can do. Everyone, including Lord Blunkett, who introduced them, regrets the effects of indeterminate sentences of imprisonment for public protection, and it is to the credit of my predecessor, Ken Clarke, that he abolished them. We need to be realistic that many of prisoners on these sentences have committed serious crime, and some are dangerous people. But there are others who have long served their minimum term and are committed to proving that they are safe for release. Of course, public protection must be our #1 priority. But it seems unjust that somebody who was sentenced in 2010 can remain in prison for years, when if that person were sentenced today, they might have an automatic release date. And that's why it's important that we tackle the backlog of these cases that are waiting for a parole board hearing. We are making progress. There are currently 3,683 of these prisoners in our jails, and last year a record 553 were released. But I've put additional resource onto this because I think there is more we can do. That's why I've set up a dedicated unit within the Ministry of Justice to ensure these cases are dealt with as efficiently as possible, whilst ensuring people are only released when it is safe to do so. I also want to ensure the system of recall works better and that we remain focused on making sure that more foreign criminals are sent home every year. In 2016, a record 5,810 foreign offenders were sent back to their home countries, and I want to build on that. To conclude, I think we all agree in this room that it is desirable to have a lower prison population. But I believe it has to be for the right reasons. Public protection is paramount, which means managing the prison population in a safe and sustainable way. I want to see the prison population go down because Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service has got better at reforming offenders. I want to see it go down because we've got better as a society at intervening earlier before people commit the crimes that lead them to prison. I want to see it go down because we've got better at managing the prison population inside our jails. Reductions by cap or quota, or by sweeping sentencing cuts, are not a magic bullet. They are a dangerous attempt at a quick fix. We need to do hard work. We need to do a lot of hard work. We need to do the hard work of improving community sentences, of dealing with problems like drink and drugs, and making our prisons more effective at reforming the people inside them. This will not be fixed in weeks or months, but if we are resolute, we will see our society become safer and we will see our prison population reduce. Thank you.
Liz, thanks so much for that fascinating speech. I think we've got time for 3 or 4 questions before she goes. Gentleman, just if you could say your name and where you're from, please.
Yeah, sure. Paul Brand from ITV News. Justice Secretary, you say there's no quick fix, but many of your predecessors think there is, just simply to send fewer people to prison. Isn't that the immediate way to reduce pressure on our prisons?
Well, as I pointed out in my speech, we are sending fewer first-time offenders to prison, and we are sending fewer people to prison for short sentences. But the fact is we have seen an increase in prosecution rates for areas like sex crime and an increase in sentences for those, which I think reflects the seriousness of those crimes. And I think it would be wrong to arbitrarily reduce those sentences or to not prosecute as many cases. So we're keeping a steady prison population. That's what's happened for the last 6 years. We're reducing the number of people coming in for the first time, but it is right that we pursue those types of dangerous crimes.
Thanks. Gentleman with the orange tie.
Thank you very much.